Clapperboard, you're about to hear an original HFY sci-fi tale titled Every Night Failed to Lift the Alien Princess, until a human mechanic carried her with one arm. HFY. Find a quiet spot, put on your headphones, and let the stars fall silent. If you enjoy cinematic sci-fi narrations, consider subscribing for more. Now, we begin. The first sound was wind moving through broken halls, a hush like the inhalation before a scream. Towers that once scraped the thin blue of Ardent Prime's upper sky leaned into that wind, shedding porcelain stone and molten glass like sparks from an anvil. In the distance, orbital cannons howled. Here in the palace heart, only the wind spoke, and the faint hum of a dying reactor buried below layers of ceremonial marble. A mechanic from the outer frontier followed that hum the way a thirsty man follows the shine of water. Cade Mercer moved with a limp that hadn't healed since the dock accident on New Perseid. Oil stained his knuckles, smoke stitched his hair into blackened curls, and a simple canvas sling held his tool bag against his ribs. He had planned to trade sealant cartridges and valve seats to Seraphian shipwrights, maybe earn enough favors to buy an old tugboat and a quiet plot under a second-hand sky. But empires die mid-conversation, and bargains burn like parchment. He walked under frescoes depicting angels of light lifting cities into the air, and he stepped over shards that mirrored his face in 40 fractured splinters. At the end of the nave, a great door stood open, its hinges groaning as the wind pressed inward and smoke breathed outward. Behind it waited the Hall of Coronations, long as a starship graveyard, tall as myth. 200 knights lined the aisle. They were not men. They were statues of metal and intent, robed in chain and dust-colored cloth, masks smooth and featureless save for narrow islets that glowed with gentle blue. Each held a spear that hummed at a pitch just beyond hearing. Their discipline was legendary, their vows so severe that lesser species turned away when they marched. In the center of that frozen army, on a dais of white stone, lay a form in ruined silk, a crown of faint light haloing a brow gone too still. The smell of ozone lingered, and the air trembled as if it remembered power and mourned its loss. Cade approached in careful steps, boots thudding, sound returning to a room that had forgotten it. The knights did not move. His chest hurt from inhaled dust, and a rag tied at his neck was black where it had once been white. He looked at the figure on the dais. She was young, or wore youth the way her people wore metal and radiance, something artful wrapped around an old soul. Her skin had the luster of pale stone. Faint lines of bioluminescent circuitry pulsed beneath it and converged beneath the small floating crown. Dark hair lay braided like thread unspooled from a loom of night, and her gown, ripped along one shoulder, revealed armor plates molded like leaves. Her lungs worked shallowly. The crown flickered. Cade looked at the knights. "You waiting on permission?" Their captain stepped forward. The movement was mechanical and perfect, yet weighted with grief. The voice that emerged reverberated through the hall, a cathedral bell tone. "We are judged and found wanting. The crown rejects us. The royal blood may be born only by one whose spirit contains no shadow of self." "Pretty," Cade said softly, "but useless. The princess cannot be moved by the unworthy." The captain lowered his spear. "We guard her until the last light. That is our oath. Your oath is getting her killed." Silence. Smoke drew lines across the air like parchment set ablaze and frozen mid-crumple. Cade stepped onto the dais. He was nobody here. He had no rank, no place in this opera of gold and ritual. But death was death in any language, and he knew the look of a reactor about to blow. He slid his right arm under her shoulders, his left behind her knees. For a heartbeat, she seemed light as a folded banner. Then the weight fell on him like a collapsing freight stack. It was not mass. It was resistance, every selfish thought in him dragged forward and forced to kneel. He felt the drag of old sins, the day he'd left a friend on a burning dock to save a crate of ration fuel and had never forgiven himself. the hard knot of lonely anger he carried between lungs when deals went bad, the quick judging eye that measured people by what they could do for him. It all rose up, heavy as gravity. He bent. He could have let go. He could have claimed that he tried. But somewhere under the pain was the simple math of engines. If the part fails, brace it. If the hull cracks, plate it. If the world ends, carry the most fragile piece and move. He hauled her against him, teeth gritted, tendons singing. Light burst from the crown with a sound like a thin glass flute held to the wind. Every knight fell to one knee. "The human bears her," whispered one from the back, disbelief like a child's joy hiding under caution. Cade swayed, breath ragged. The weight lessened. Not gone, never gone, but tolerable as work. He turned. The captain moved aside, spear slanted in salute, faceless mask canted almost as if in wonder. The palace shook. Distant thunder rose, then the sharp ululation of Zither artillery, insectile engines purring in coordinated chorus. The enemy had come not for plunder but for conversion. Break the old empire into nutrient paste and feed it to the Dominion. They had cracked the planetary grid and eaten its power through their cables like spiders drinking the nerves of prey. Cade adjusted his grip. The princess's eyelids fluttered. He could feel the heat of her breath against his collarbone. He could hear his heartbeat echoing off the high gold and white. "Which way to the nearest dock?" he said. The captain extended an arm. "Through the south gallery, the last shuttle waits if it still lives. Then we go." Cade tightened his hold. "Keep the road clear." And the metal angels obeyed the human in oil-stained boots. They moved. Knights formed a corridor, spears lifting to cast arcs of protective light. Cade went first, step after deliberate step, weight shifting from sore hip to stubborn knee. He did not think of the soldiers he passed, broken and slumped in alcoves like burned candles. He did not think of the melted frescoes or the way the wind carried a note of copper, the atomized blood of those who had dissolved into aerosol under Zither beams. He thought only of the thing in his arms, a life, a responsibility, a fragile reactor he would not let go cold. She spoke once as they turned into the south gallery. The words were little more than breath, yet they carried with that bell tone the Seraphians wove into everything. "You are not of us." "No," he said, "but I'm here." Her head tilted, crown of light stuttering. "Worth is in the carrying." "Maybe," he said and didn't say, "or in the not letting go." The South Gallery had once been a river of light, a place where children ran under the gaze of ancestors carved from crystal. Now the windows were black scars where invading beams had written their red script across the walls. Past the gallery lay the hangar. Past the hangar, if the gods didn't laugh, lay sky. A bladed drone scuttled along the ceiling like a beetle under a bowl. It dropped with the quickness of machines that know only the next instruction. Cade rolled his shoulder, sheltering the princess, and a spear of white punched it from the air. The captain moved like a drawn line, becoming a thrust, and the drone fell smoking. "On," Cade gasped. The weight pulsed again, an old memory rising, his father's back bent under crates, while storms shredded the tin roofs of their settlement. The man never complained, never boasted, just moved weight to safety, then took the next. The hangar was a ruin stitched together by hope. Bent girders like the ribs of a whale arced overhead. Smoke crawled along the floor, thick enough to hide bodies, thin enough to show shapes moving in it. One shuttle remained intact enough to pretend it could fly. A crew of 3 worked its belly, wrenching at a stuck fuel line that hissed like a snake. Up on the gantry, Zither shapes scuttled, spidery silhouettes studded with glare-shot eyes. "Cover!" The captain boomed, and the last 24 knights raised shields rooted to the floor with a harmonic thrum that turned incoming shots into thrown pebbles against a drum's skin. Cade moved among them, a small human with a god in his arms, and the Seraphians parted for him as if he were the needle that would stitch the wound closed. The shuttle crew stared when they saw him. One recovered first, a woman with filigreed face tattoos and one arm in a sling. "By all lights," she whispered. "He carries her." "I need that door," Cade said. "It opens if you live to reach it." She tapped a control bead. The ramp groaned downward, then stuck halfway when a bent brace protested. Cade shifted the princess to one arm. Something in his shoulder tore and lit his nerves with a comet. He hooked fingers into the buckled ramp rib, put his feet on the scored floor, and heaved. The metal screamed, then moved. He shoved it into place with a last reserve of breath. Behind him, the shields cracked, a high keening like glass under too much heat. The captain barked an order. Two knights stepped forward and locked arms, their bodies becoming a wedge that split incoming fire and hurled it into the floor. The Xyther drones reacted as one, eyes flaring, legs scything. They were not brave, not cowardly. They were simply lines of code seeking completion. Cade climbed, breath a rasp. The princess's eyes were open now, green like seagrass lit from beneath. She held his gaze with the steady calm of someone who had watched empires rise and fall as we watch seasons. "You burn," she breathed. "Working on it," he grunted. The deck swallowed them. The shuttle shuddered as a blast punched a divot into its side. The pilot, an old Seraphian with cracked plates at his temples, lifted his chin. "Engines are borderline. Borderline runs," Cade said, "until it does not. Then we run before that moment." The pilot's mouth tilted. Seraphians learned smiles late. They wore them like ornaments hand-soldered to an ancient device. "Strap in. Bearer." Cade laid the princess on a medical pallet that hummed weakly and flickered when it tried to elevate. He slid foam wedges under her shoulders, checked her pulse though he understood nothing of Seraphian biochemistry, and found only the human reassurance that there was rhythm. He grabbed for a still-smoking carbine on the floor, but the captain's hand landed gently on the barrel. "Protect her," the captain said. "I plan to." "From yourself as well," the captain murmured, almost tender, and turned to face the open ramp where his soldiers died in disciplined lines. He stood there a moment, silhouette black against smoke and fire, spear tip aglow like a faint star. Then he moved forward and the ramp rose, and Cade's last sight of him was a simple act. A turning of the head toward the human who had done what he could not, a nod that meant more than any oath carved into a spear shaft. They launched. The engines were wounded animals shaking off predators. The hull groaned as if remembering the weight of atmosphere it had always held at bay. The ground fell away. Fire became a carpet they slid across. Distant guns traced broken geometry in the sky. At the edge of the upper clouds, the engine coughed once, caught, and sang. The princess slept. Cade didn't. He prowled the shuttle like a small storm with a spanner for a heart. He stored weight where the bulkheads could take it. He rewired a failing environmental control with a piece of melted stanchion and an oath. He tightened bolts nobody else noticed, because that is what mechanics do when they cannot sleep. They save ships in increments too small for tall tales. 3 days to the rendezvous. In those days, space was not silence but work. The whine of pumps, the click of relays, the rumble of a tired fusion bottle. The crew bled from superficial cuts and deep places you could only see when they stared too long at their hands. Cade brought them coffee he'd brewed in a soup can and called it the finest in 3 sectors. And because he said it with that crooked grin people get on the dirty edges of civilization, they believed him. The princess woke the second night. She stared at the ceiling for a long time, then turned her head toward him. He had fallen asleep in a chair with his tool bag as pillow, posture folded in that curious origami only exhausted people manage. "You are hurt," she said. He jerked awake, then winced. "No more than usual." "You carried me." Seemed like a good idea at the time. He rubbed his face. "I'm Cade," she considered. "I am Ara Tel Seraph. Naming is strange now. The crown Harris is gone." "The crown what?" "An old word. It means both circlet and song." Ara flexed her hand, watching light pulse under her skin. "We bound authority to carrying. The true ruler is the one who lifts when all others fail. Seems like a good measurement." It is a hard one. She looked at him again, the way one might examine a machine that should have failed but ran anyway. You lifted without promise of reward. I lifted because leaving someone on the floor is heavier than picking them up. She smiled. It was a tired expression and more beautiful for it. Honor in plain cloth. He shrugged. I'm more duct tape than cloth. She slept again. He sat awake longer than he should have, staring at her and seeing not a princess but a person caught in the gears of history, and wondering what kind of man the crown had declared him by letting him lift her. Worthiness is a word that never sat well on his tongue. Most days he felt like a half-tightened bolt that held because nothing shook it too hard. He thought about the night captain on the ramp and said quietly to the empty air, I hope you meant that nod. The rendezvous point was the shattered moon of Outremer, a shard field braided with force lines like harp strings. In the dark, ships gathered, human frigates held together by prayer and weld, Seraphian cruisers with their proud lattices scorched, a dozen vessels that had never meant to be warships, mining hulks, research cutters, now wearing armor like borrowed coats. They drifted beneath a dead sun and waited for the Dominion to find them. It didn't take long. The Zither fleet came smooth as a blade sliding from a sheath. Black hulls with iridescent underscales, habit spires bristling with the curled bones of captured stations. Their communication came as a pulse the brain interpreted as insects speaking in one voice. We will rewrite your pattern. We will harvest purpose from your random. Humans answered with a simple burst. No. Seraphians answered with music, a chord progression older than recorded memory, a tone the knights used to harmonize their drives. The two responses climbed around each other like ivy and iron. Marauders and angels stood side by side. Cade, who had spent his life under engines, felt in his bones that any system built by such an alliance could not be so easily unclasped. They chose Ara to speak across the channel. She sat upright on the bridge of the Aegis Dawn, a ship that had once been a museum piece, and now wore new armor wherein old names were etched, names of those who had not made it off Ardent Prime. Cade stood behind her chair because when a part fails near you, you keep your tools handy. Ara's voice filled the flat light of the bridge. Zither Dominion, you have eaten 1,000 songs and left only scratching in the dark. You will not feed here. The voice of the Zither was neither anger nor contempt. Code did not waste cycles on emotion. You who were held aloft cannot stand alone. Your knights failed to lift you. Their line is corrupt. We bring correction. A hush, eyes on Ara, then on Cade, then on the ghost of that hall where the invisible weight had crushed pride. Ara's gaze touched him briefly and returned to the void. A human carried me, she said. Thus I do not stand alone, and where a single human stands, countless follow. Cade said nothing. It was not his place to speak for a species. It was enough to be exactly what he had been, a body that did not drop the load. War is music and mathematics. It wakes both poets and accountants. The first barrage wrote bright figures on the dark and erased ships that had names, and those names lived on only as hatches drifting like monuments. Cade moved in 90-second bursts. Check coolant flow on B-bank. Swap out a failing capacitor the size of his forearm. Reroute feed lines when a glancing hit turned an entire panel into smoke and shrapnel. The crew around him labored in their own circles, gun crews, shield techs, the pilot with his long engineer's hands singing across the controls. Between alarms he watched Ara. She did not command like a monarch. She pointed, repeated calmly, listened. When a young human tech broke down in tears because the friend she'd sent to patch a hull crack hadn't answered her hails, Ara reached out and simply rested a hand on the tech's shoulder and let her cry for 20 seconds, exactly 20, then said, "Now we work in his name." Cade loved her in that moment with a clear, honorable love that asked nothing. He understood carrying with hands, she carried with presence. Later, alone in a maintenance crawl space with coolant dripping on his forehead, he whispered to the metal, You keep her alive and I'll keep you alive. He made bargains with machines because machines always kept up their end if properly coaxed. The Dominion pushed. Human ships snapped under beams. Seraphian cruisers countercut with knives of condensed music. The Aegis Dawn took blows and delivered them. On the third pass a Zither vessel as big as a small city interposed itself and opened like a flower. Inside lay the drones hatching vaults, a hive body's womb. The vault's walls pulsed, the gun ports extruded like teeth. Something vast prepared to be born. Ara looked back over her shoulder. Cade. He knew the question, he knew the cost. We can ram the core if I hold the bottle steady long enough to keep it from pre-igniting. We'll go critical at 20 meters inside the vault. She nodded. Can you hold it? He smiled with a cracked calm he had learned in shipyards that smelled of salt and ozone. I carried you. She closed her eyes for one breath, opened them. Then we become a blade. Alarms clawed the air. The pilot whispered something like a prayer in a language called engineering. The Aegis Dawn turned. The vault's mouth opened wider, tasting. Cade ran. Hands moved because hands remember practice when mind empties. He tore off a blistered panel and dove into the space behind it where the fusion bottle's control harness lived. The bottle vibrated like a plucked string about to break. He saw in it the same pulse as the crown that had floated over Ara, power bridled to judgment. He spoke to it as he would to a frightened animal. Steady, girl, not yet. The bottle shuddered, trying to cascade. He tightened one screw until it shrieked, loosened another until the pitch dropped into a growl, slid a shim made from the handle of a broken wrench into a gap the thickness of a credit. The core's pre-igniters went from angry blue to righteous white. He crawled out, shirt stuck to his back, lungs cutting him like knives. He made the bridge with seconds left. Ara stood. She did not wear a crown now, she wore a mechanic's sling he'd given her, a dirty strip of cloth she'd looped around her arm because it reminded her of the feeling of being carried. She reached for his hand and squeezed it once. In that squeeze were 1,000 words, thank you, forgive me, live, and the simplest old phrase, we are together even if apart. The hull trembled as they entered the vault. Inside, rows upon rows of nascent drones hung like the underside of a coral shelf. Their eyes were closed. They were not yet monsters. They were possibility on rails. Cade thought about killing them and felt the human ache of doing what must be done to stop worse. The pilot whispered, now, and Ara nodded, and Cade's hand closed on the trigger that would overfeed the core, and for a heartbeat he felt the weight he had felt lifting her, and he understood. Worthiness isn't a state you achieve and keep. It's a choice renewed with every breath. He pressed the trigger. White. Silence. Memory returns in fragments after light like that. He knew breath. He knew dark. He knew the weight of not being dead and hating the air for not being her perfume of heated porcelain and ozone. He floated, slow tumble among plating shards and frozen tiers of metal that had once been the Aegis Dawn. A tether snapped silent across his chest. Far away, like lanterns hung in a long night, flares marked rescue skiffs. He whispered, because mice whisper inside walls and men whisper at the edge of void, Ara. Something touched his shoulder, not a hand, a pressure like a remembered warmth wrapped around a present ache. He turned, no one near, the void blinked. His face cracked into something like a laugh and terror married. You stubborn woman. Rescue took him. He woke on a human frigate that smelled of antiseptic and coffee boiled too long. Bandages wrapped his chest as if a careful child had tried to bind a wounded bird. The medic said too many ribs were cracked. He should be grateful to have enough to count. He told the medic gratitude was a fuel line that never ran dry when it was real, and the medic laughed because nobody talks like that unless they have been near death enough to treat it like an old neighbor who plants ugly flowers. News came in waves. The vault was gone. The Dominion reeled. The Seraphian survivors sang an old song and wove into it a new stanza of human chords. Fleet ragged but alive. Knights scattered in small squads across planets that needed liberation from the quiet tyranny of coded will. And this, carrying in on quiet feet, no body found for Ara tells Seraph. Cade lay very still for a long time. He did not cry because tears require water and he had none to spare. He stared at the ceiling until the cracks became constellations. He spoke once, to no one and to the ship's bones. Then she is working. Humans build memorials like they build machines. They assemble parts on hand and bolt them together with stubborn love. They took a warped section of Aegis Dawn's hull and stood it upright on a new station spun in the dust of Outremer. They painted the names of the lost in white that would not yellow under hard light. Cade found the old knight captain's name among them and placed his fingertips there. "I saw the nod," he whispered. "I'll keep lifting." The station chief offered him a small quarters and a modest post, the kind of life he had once wanted. He took the quarters for 2 nights, and on the 3rd he left a note, got called to fix a bigger machine, signed with a grease fingerprint because signatures are lonely without the mark of work. He became a rumor people met the way travelers meet rain, sometimes in a steady fall that cleaned the world, sometimes in a sudden torrent that changed the landscape overnight. On Rix, he climbed into a flooded reactor and braced a collapsing plate while 63 refugees ran past him. They told the story as if he were 7 men. On the ring farms of Tycho Laureate, he rerouted old conveyors into evacuation trams and rode the first one out only after an old woman hit him with a shoe. On the frost planet Kaer, he taught Seraphian and human children to repair wind vanes, and when a Xyther raiding node locked onto him, the children stacked boxes and made a shield and shouted until soldiers came. He always moved on. He left machines humming, people a little taller, and the sense that endurance could be learned like a skill. Sometimes, at stations that smelled of fried starch and warm metal, he heard a new rumor braided through the others. A woman with eyes like deep water and a voice like a bell fixing broken comm arrays, and walking into rooms where violence was brewing and speaking until pulses steadied. They said she wore no crown, only a strip of cloth tied at her arm. On a lunar dock above Helix Theta he saw her. Of course he did, because this was a universe that, after trying to kill everything worth saving, sometimes allowed the mercy of reunion. She stood by a power coupling half her height, hair braided back, sleeves shoved to the elbow, a wrench in her hand that had lived in his bag once. When she looked up, her smile was the first sunrise after a long storm. They didn't speak at first. They stood, and the hush around them felt like the Hall of Coronations had felt when the crown song changed its mind about worthiness. Finally, "You died," he said. She tilted her head. I stopped. Then started again. "I am learning illegitimate mechanics." He grinned. "The best kind." They walked. Their hands brushed and did not link, and then linked and did not pretend otherwise. She told him how the explosion had flung her into the vault's service ducts, how a broken drone had given her cover, how a vision had come to her in the dark, not a voice but a weight and the decision to carry it. She spoke of the crown Harris, how it had been not a thing but a field of judgment, how it had once chosen her people according to beauty they confused for goodness, and how, in its dying, it had become simpler. The one who lifts is the one who leads. He told her about learning not to be the center of his own gravity. They laughed at themselves and at grief's strange polite habits, how it tapped the shoulder weeks later and asked for a dance. The Xyther Dominion was not finished. Code adapts. The next waves were subtler. Infiltration mimicked signals, offers of quiet assimilation disguised as solutions. Humans have an evolutionary allergy to offers that erase them. Seraphians had relearned the same. Together they built an answer not in a single flagship or a single leader but in a mesh. Villages teaching villages to repair, stations teaching stations to resist, story teaching story until the weave held. Cade and Ara became nodal, not royal. The knights, freed from old code, broke into small companies that carried not orders but skills. A knight leaning over a human child's shoulder saying, "Your solder is beautiful," that saved more lives than a spear. When the Dominion realized brute force would no longer yield clean harvest, it tried to break the mesh by striking its symbols. Cade and Ara felt more than knew the crosshairs sliding toward them. They moved anyway. On the desert moon Var, they lifted 43 pilgrims out of a canyon when the Dominion poisoned the lower air with conductive mist that set lungs on fire. Ara walked into a calm tower being used as a gallows and spoke until the rope slackened. Cade spent a night welding in a sandstorm because the emergency shelter door would not close and the storm did not care if you had good excuses. People began to carry their own, not out of obedience but imitation. The mesh matured. There was a final battle because stories have bones and those bones require certain joints. It came over the amber world of Kalis, where the Dominion had seeded a hive beneath the ice. The hive rose like a black cathedral dragged sideways through an ocean, screaming its scrapes into the electromagnetic spectrum. Fleets converged. Humans in ships named after virtues that are really behaviors. Grit, grace, keep going. Seraphians in vessels named after songs that old men whistled when they thought nobody listened. The sky above Kalis filled with bright arithmetic. Cade stood on the bridge of a ship that used to be a garbage scow and was now a knife, and Ara stood beside him with a hand on the navigation rings and another on the back of his neck, fingers warm and steady. He remembered lifting her. He remembered a cathedral of failure becoming a corridor of courage. He remembered the captain's nod and the crown's flare and how the weight had shifted when he chose not to count the cost. He carried that memory like a tool. The Dominion's last gambit was simple. It opened every channel and spoke in 1,000 voices at once, all the voices of loved ones stolen and digitized and played back. "Lay down," said mothers. "Rest," said fathers. "We will carry you," said friends, sweet voices turning knives in the softest parts. Some crews broke, some placed palms over ears and sobbed and kept working. Cade looked at Ara and Ara looked at Cade and they listened, and they honored the voices for what they had been before they were stolen, and then they spoke not to the enemy but to the mesh itself. Ara, lift. Cade, now. Across 100 ships, men and women and Seraphians and those between shifted weight. Shields rose and did not crack. Small craft dove in the spaces big ships could not see. A knight in an exosuit braced her boot against a hissing valve and held it shut with one shoulder, while a 12-year-old ran past with a coil of wire like a sacrament. The hive over Kalis split when a dozen tiny ships flew into it at once and detonated anchors that engineers had built from farm equipment, because necessity writes manuals nobody expects. The Dominion tried to flee and found itself netted by people it had called random. Cade and Ara did not press for the kill. They stood and watched their allies do the work they had taught themselves. "We are not conquerors," Ara said. "We are carriers," Cade said. The hive sank. The sea boiled where it fell, then smoothed, then opened to reveal the bodies of the drowned Dominion drones floating like black petals. The combined fleet did not cheer. It breathed. It began tallying damage. It whispered names. Afterward, there were endless tasks, the kind that do not fit in ballads but feed children. Cade repaired a bakery oven in a station where the baker had fed fighters when they were losing. Ara sat with a man who had shot at her people once and had been forgiven by everyone except himself. She said nothing for an hour and then said, "Carry this with me," and he did, and it became bearable. They slept when they could. They learned to be quiet together. They learned that love can be the act of lifting yesterday's grief from one another's shoulders before lifting the world again. Years passed like brave ships docking and departing. Statues rose in some places. Cade hated them. Ara tolerated them like stubborn weeds on a useful path. and in other places there were no statues because the people had learned the better memorial of doing the thing in their own hands. The knights wrote a new vow: we lift first. They practiced it by arriving with toolboxes instead of weapons. The Seraphian crown Harris remained only in songs, where it floated over heads as an invisible weight that both tried the soul and made the shoulders stronger. Humans laughed more easily and fought with less swagger because they had seen too much to treat war like theater. Once, during a supply run to a quiet moon where storms spoke in crackling blue tongues, Cade found himself alone in the belly of an old hauler staring at a cracked support strut that would fail under the next heavy load. He set a jack, slung a chain, and began to take the weight with one arm while sliding the new strut into place with the other. Sweat got into his eyes. He thought of the haul on Ardent Prime and smiled because pain had become an old friend who told the truth. Ara's voice drifted down the ladder. Need a hand? I've got one left, he called back. Then I will carry the next. Deal. They made fewer speeches as time went on. They did more things that looked like chores. Sometimes someone would recognize them and try to kneel. Cade would tug them up in emotion older than politics and say, help me lift this. And then all kneeling would be forgotten because the radiator would be leaking or the food line stuck or a child crying under a load he thought he must bear alone. The galaxy did not become gentle. It never had been. New threats arose, old habits returned in cunning clothes. Greedy men tried to solder their names over the mesh. Yet something had changed in the foundational code of countless cultures. The image had shifted. Where once people told stories about saviors descending with shining swords, now they told a story about a man in dirty boots lifting a princess when every knight failed, and about a princess throwing away her invisible throne to lift with both hands. The story ate other stories by making them better. On the anniversary of Ardent Prime, Cade and Ara stood together under a repair gantry whose shadow drew a frame around them. They had come to watch the sun set on a world the Dominion had once marked for digestion, and the mesh had reclaimed with seeds and pipelines. Farmers cheered machines as if they were friends returned from war, because in a way they were. Children rolled wrenches along the ground like toy cars. A boy tugged at Cade's sleeve. Sir, he said in the small voice of those who have just realized adults are tellers of secrets, how did you lift her with one arm? Cade knelt, which made his ribs ache the way they always would. He liked the ache because it meant he had kept his bargain. He tapped the boy's chest. I used this, he said, my heart, the part that decides to try again when the first try hurts. The boy considered, is that all? That's almost everything. The boy looked at Ara with shy awe. Are you a princess? Ara's smile held grief and joy like a torch holds shadow at bay. I am a carrier, she said, like you will be. What will I carry? Someone else's heavy thing, Cade said. One day you'll see it, you'll want to walk away, you won't. The boy nodded solemnly as if accepting a small, heavy crown none could see. He ran away. Cade stood with a slow grunt. Ara slipped her arm through his, and for a while they said nothing. The sky went ember orange. A convoy clanked past loaded with beams for a school. A knight rode shotgun and played a mouth harp. Somewhere a voice began a song that had once been a war hymn and now was a working tune, and others picked it up and people lifted things, literal, metaphorical, some too heavy to name out loud. When the first stars appeared, Cade turned to Ara. Do you miss it? He asked. What? The crown that sang judgments. She looked up. No, I have a better measure now. She leaned her shoulder against his. How much weight did you carry today? He considered. Enough. Then you are worthy. He made a face. I hate that word. So do I, she said, but we cannot throw it away. We must empty it and fill it with new meaning. Worthy is not chosen. Worthy is carried. They stood under a sky where ships made their slow, careful paths. Below that sky people built, mended, fed, sang. Cade thought of the hall with 200 kneeling knights, and of the moment the crown's light had flared, and of the sound a dying empire made when it chose mercy as its last song. He thought of all the places since where someone had said, "I can't," and then had. He pressed his forehead briefly to Ara's temple. "Tomorrow," he said. "Tomorrow," she echoed. He slept almost immediately that night because exhaustion is the truest lullaby, and because trust is a better pillow than pride. He dreamed, rare for him, of a world where children practiced lifting each other's backpacks as if rehearsing for something grand, and in the dream he laughed because nothing was grander. When morning came, the work waited. They went to it. The galaxy spun. Somewhere far away a new power woke and wondered who ruled here. The mesh hummed and the answer floated through it, not like a decree but like a habit, a motion of hands. No one, everyone, the one who lifts first leads. It was not a perfect answer. It was better. It asked each listener to make it true. As for Cade Mercer, human mechanic, bearer of a princess and 1,000 small burdens, he took his breakfast with his back against a warm bulkhead and his boots crossed at the ankle and grease under his nails. And when a child asked for help with a stuck hinge, he rose without finishing his toast. Ara watched him go with fondness that was worship stripped of its dangerous glitter, and then she went to a whiteboard to explain torque to 5 eager minds as if torque were an ethic, which perhaps it was. They did not live forever. They lived well and long, and exactly as long as this story needs them to. When their day came, it was not on a battlefield but on a pier where ships had strange names and sunsets came in purple stripes. They sat. They leaned shoulder to shoulder. They watched a boy they had once taught lift his own child onto his shoulders, and laughed, and looked at one another, and agreed without words that this was an ending that carried as much as it was carried. But that is another tale, a small one, told softly. This tale ends not with death, but with a lesson the galaxy will keep revisiting like a mechanic returns to the same stubborn bolt each morning, until it finally yields to patience. Because in the end, when the grand structures fail and gilded codes bow under their own romance, it is always someone in simple boots and sleeves rolled. It is always someone with ordinary hands, who will bend and lift and carry. Not because a crown told them they were pure, not because the world will sing their name, but because the weight is there and the path forward waits just beyond the next step. And that day, the galaxy learned, humanity doesn't conquer, it endures. Headphone, if you enjoyed this story, make sure to like, share, and subscribe to the channel for more epic HFY sci-fi tales. Until next time, stay human, stay unbroken.